Hello, my name is Moti Gorin. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Colorado State University. And I'm here with a special guest, Professor Holly Lawford-Smith, who is an associate professor of political philosophy in Melbourne, in Australia. And we're here to talk about her new book. I guess you can't see that.
You
Gender
can't.
Critical Feminism.
You almost
Uh,
can, really close up, yeah.
yeah, okay. This is what it looks like. Gender Critical Feminism, and it was published by Oxford University Press just this past spring of 2022. And we're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about some of the sort of background, sort of social, political, and professional context in which the book was published. And so I thought we'd start, if Holly doesn't mind, by hearing a little bit from her about how she became interested in the topics that she discusses in the book. Looking at your background, you have been publishing for years on topics in political philosophy. You've been thinking about climate change and collective action and collective responsibility. Before that, or maybe simultaneously, but certainly before that as well, you were thinking about political feasibility, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so this turn towards really focusing on feminism is a relatively new topic for you. So I'm just curious, how did you start thinking about this? Why do you find it important and interesting, and so on?
Mm. Just to start forwards and then go back, this is quite funny
Yeah.
because at my book launch in the UK, Kathleen Stock was one of the sort of people involved, and we did this sort of interview live chat thing. And she said, "What do you think about the moral responsibility or collective responsibility for what's going on now with feminism and trans activism?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, I don't know." It was so funny because it was such a classic part of my work for the last 10 years or so. And it was just not remotely an aspect of my thinking about this project. So yeah, it was kind of strange. It has been a really big pivot.
That sounds like a new paper idea.
Maybe it was. As soon as she said it, I thought, oh yeah, that is something I should have a view on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I tend to have this typical origin story which involves Kathleen's Medium essay, but I was thinking about it the other day, and it actually started earlier than that. When I first got to the University of Melbourne, it was in the first few months of getting here, so that's early 2017. Cordelia Fine was giving a public lecture. And of course, she, I think, was at the time publicizing Testosterone Rex, which must have come out sort of recently around that time. And it was my first experience with a trans activist. There was a trans activist in the audience. I didn't know the type at the time, I didn't know the behavior, but there was this person who just went off in the question time about the fact that she had talked about the two sexes and testosterone's role in the male sex. And this person seemed so furious that she had called one of the systems male and one of the systems female. And it was fascinating to me how social norm violating this person in the audience was. They were just so aggressive and
Yeah.
unreasonable. So I just found it all quirky. I didn't know that's a movement.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Cordelia about it afterwards, what the hell? That was so strange. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
it was kind of probably 6 months after that, I became aware one of our PhD students was being ostracized by other students because she had what I would then later understand were gender critical views, but I just kind of had heard these vague, oh, people are calling her these slurs and she has the wrong feminism. Well, what do I know about feminism? I don't know. So I remember having a coffee with her to try to find out how things were going and offer some support, but it was a personal thing, right? It wasn't about the intricacies of the debate. And then it was sometime later in 2018 when Kathleen wrote her essay for Medium that kicked off all of the pushback against her, asking about the Gender Recognition Act consultation in the UK. And then that's when I really got brought in because I was like, this is how they are treating her is just outrageous. And that's what sucked me into like curiosity to learn more, fury about how philosophers were reacting to that, and then just kind of getting down the rabbit hole and becoming curious enough to start working on it.
Okay, so you became sort of interested in the substance of the debate via what was going on professionally,
Yeah,
and what you were witnessing, and how other philosophers, namely Kathleen Stock, were being treated by other philosophers and by people in general.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, so on sort of very closely related to that. Before we get into the book, I want to talk a little bit more about these sorts of this sort of background, this environment. You have faced quite a bit of, well, it goes stronger than criticism, because you've faced more non-intellectual criticism than criticism.
Mm.
So, with respect to this, your new book that's just out in the spring, there was an open letter. I'm not sure whether it really qualifies for an open letter. I never, the signatories were
Never made
not public.
public. Yeah.
They were made public.
No, they were never made public.
They were never made public, which I found a bit curious.
Yeah.
Usually, open letters, you've got public signatories. So, but in any case, there was this letter, and it wasn't written by a philosopher. I think it was written by a professor of English or something like that. Um, and the point of the letter was to express this sort of grave concern to Oxford University Press that they were publishing, and there were a number of sort of objections. One was that you're just generally a bigot, and a transphobe, and it's unfortunate that OUP would be soiling themselves, this kind of talk. And then there was this sort of proto-substantive objection about what gender critical feminism is. It's not a field. I don't think anybody ever claims it's a field. It's a substantive position, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that letter got some traction, at least online. Presumably, there were people signing it. Presumably, some philosophers were signing it. But Oxford responded by saying, "Yeah." Then there were worries. Did the right people review it? Did you say, here are some of our friends that you should have sent it to?
Yeah.
Right? Here's some examples of the sorts of people that you should have sent it to review. And how could this possibly have been published by a reputable press? That was the kind of general tenor of one of the worries.
Yeah.
OUP responded by saying, of course, we have mechanisms in place to ensure that the review process is robust, and so on. But how, sort of an odd letter. There were no substantive objections to the book because nobody had read it yet.
Right.
But there were these pointing at, like, well, these people have said that she's transphobic, right? And those people, if you look at what they say, it's that somebody else has said there's transphobic. And so it's like, so long as somebody has the chutzpah to throw the first stone, then everybody else just points. There's this line of pointing at the first, and ultimately it goes down to the first stone thrower, who very often doesn't raise a substantive debate. So how does this, what do you make of this sort of dynamic where books are criticized before they come out, and people are labeled bigots and so forth on the basis of what other people have accused them of being, but without ever raising substantive objections to the view? It's something you think with.
Yeah, I mean, it's very strange. I suppose they had what we would call, philosophers would call like a folk conception of gender critical feminism, right? They, from their side of the debate, so they had a sense of, oh, that's just like people who hate trans people don't want trans people to have rights, whatever hyperbolic, inflated beliefs they like to attribute to the whole feminist crowd. Okay, oh, now there's a book that has the name of that movement that I hate and don't really understand and have never been able to like articulate its claims. Oh, then the book must have this content, right? So there's this huge leaps in reasoning, but okay, now it's a big threat that this prestigious publisher is publishing this book with the name of a movement that I hate. So now I must oppose that because I oppose its values at their core, regardless of this author or what she could possibly have to say. I take it that's the move. I can't actually remember how much the letters were targeting me as a person and things I have done, or just what the book must be about given what it's called. Do you remember? I just can't really remember.
There was both. I recently reread it.
Okay.
There were, they were pointing at the fact that your university had released some statement about your work, I believe, and so that was an indication that there must be, where there's it's a kind of where there's smoke, there's fire, kind of approach. So there were, I mean, there were definitely accusations against you being transphobic and having said things and done things that seem to express a hostility and bigotry towards trans people, that you want to, that you're questioning their right to exist, and this sort of eliminationist language. And
Always
this sort
that
of,
phrase, always that
yeah,
exist. Ugh, yeah, it's so
yeah.
annoying.
And so yeah, and there's been similar sorts of I don't really want to call them concerns, but similar sorts of expressions of disapproval on in the professional philosophy world, right, on some philosophy blogs and so forth,
Yeah.
the way things are framed, right, that you're being criticized for a transphobic website, and so forth, but very few substantive criticisms of gender critical feminism.
Right.
And so, have you seen? You clearly, you're engaged in this much more deeply than I am. Have you gotten via email, via other sort of venues, people raising substantive critiques of your position, or is it by and large these sorts of hand wavy accusations of wanting to eliminate people and so forth?
The latter. Never has anyone got in touch with a substantive disagreement. The entire approach from that side, whether it's academics or activists, is like hostile ignoring, hashtag no debating, never
Yes.
inviting you anywhere to
Yes.
anything. So the feeling for the last 4 years or so has just been of being kind of blacklisted.
Yes.
So I'm, of course, dying for substantial criticism.
Yeah.
And I've said this before in other kind of places. It's extremely frustrating to me to have to do their work for them as well as my own. Normally in philosophy, right, you have your interlocutors, and all you have to
Yeah.
do is kind of show up to the workshop or to the departmental
Right.
seminar where you know at least one of your opponents is going to be, and they do their own work. But it's such a strange thing in this debate. People who are working in this area, Alex Byrne, Thomas Bogadas, Kathleen Stock, we are all like having to do all their work, to be charitable enough to their positions, to then arguing against their positions. But it's
Yes.
all this
Yeah.
conversation with ourselves against the wall because they're not there. So it's really very strange compared to other ways of doing philosophy.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that too, and I can't think of another kind of debate where that. And there's a plenty of really controversial debates in philosophy. I work in applied ethics. I work in bioethics, and so questions of life and death. There are
Lots.
people who write about race, which is another extremely
Yep.
important and sensitive topic where the stakes are really high.
Yep.
People give different accounts of race, different accounts of racism. And it seems like even where people strongly disagree, they disagree on the substance.
Yes.
And at least they can disagree on the substance. They might also think that someone's a jerk. They might also think that someone's doing something that is unjust, but they explain why that is and what the connection is between the substantive view and the purported, harm or what have you. And you just don't see that in this debate.
Yeah.
Um, so before we get the book, I just wanted to talk about one other thing that I find sort of fascinating about this debate, much of which seems to occur at the level of sort of public relations rather than philosophical substance. But we saw this in a fairly recent piece by Judith Butler in The Guardian, where gender critical feminism was sort of lumped in with sort of right wing fascist movements. We know very well in the United States, because we have a kind of sexually puritanical culture, and we have a real sort of problem. It's gotten worse over the last whatever it's been 6 years, but it's always been there. um, with anti-LGBT sentiment, and the right has really jumped on this debate because they see that it's strategically beneficial for them to do so.
Mm.
And then you get this kind of polarization. I don't know what things are like in Australia, where if anybody raises questions about, I don't know, pediatric gender care or about single sex spaces, what immediately pops into the heads of most people who aren't following these things very closely and who aren't reading the arguments is like, oh, this is just another Donald Trump kind of apologist here. It's us versus them. Um, Most people these days, most sort of quote unquote good liberals are on board with LGBT rights.
Yeah.
You add the T to that, and it must be another example of what's going on here. They don't find it at all puzzling that some of the biggest targets have been lesbians. I don't know why that doesn't raise any flags for them. That is targets of the sort of more extreme trans rights activists. Um, but when you look at some of the most prominent gender critical feminists, we're not talking about the Donald Trumps of the world, right? We're talking about people with long histories of working on behalf of the rights of sexual minorities, racial minorities, people who describe themselves as socialists, people who are certainly well to the left of the center, whether it's in the UK or United States.
Yeah.
And it's a really unfortunate sort of form of polarization where it gets sucked into these larger culture war issues, and people can simply say you're either with us or you're with them. And
Yeah.
what are things like in Australia? Is that a similar dynamic? I'm not familiar with Australian sort of politics.
I think it's not exactly a similar dynamic. I think we're sort of lucky that the UK got so far ahead of this before it came here, and I think we actually got it before you did in a way. And that helped because, of course, if America gets anything first, there's just this sort of like cultural dominance, right, where it's like sets the tone for everything else. But I think because it was so clear that there were so many left wing and sort of centrist and trade unionist women involved in the UK, and we sort of got it like on the tails of them. All the legal changes started happening in Victoria in like 2019, I think. So I think we had that advantage being able to sort of frame it off the back of that. There was a bit of that sort of polarization just this year when conservative, politically conservative, gender critical woman who had been spearheading the Save Women's sports group here. She ran for a position in the Liberal Party, which is our Conservative Party, and then the media just went to town on her position on trans things, trying to sort of turn it into a polarized issue, and that had some success. She became like I think she was the second most talked about political figure after the Prime Minister during that period. So it did sort of bring the issues up in that politically polarized way. But it's been, I don't know what you think of this, but I've sort of noticed right from the start, and actually some of the philosophers were guilty of this, there was this sort of manipulative pressure for left-wing feminists in other countries with completely different politics, like UK and Australia, where there is already very minimal gatekeeping for transition, for example, and we're talking about moving to self-ID instead of 7 counseling sessions. But there was all this pressure from the US feminists that we don't risk the US somehow getting the wrong politics on trans issues, as though every feminist ever in the world should shut up just in case that has some impact on the left-wing priorities in the United States, which I just find the most like self-centered, bizarre stuff I've ever come across. Like, I don't do you...
we Americans are known for that, right? I mean, we're the center of the world.
Yeah, like what?
I don't mean that.
Unselfconsciously, like what?
Yeah. No, I'm not endorsing that. But we see. I mean, it's you notice this isn't any kind of novel point, but you notice when you travel, when you watch news in other countries, they're talking about other. It's very rare for us to be thinking about other countries and other perspectives. We're very much a very sort of provincial country in that regard. And because of the election of Donald Trump, I mean, it broke a lot of people's brains. And the dangers are very, very real. And so I think there's a kind of a real reluctance or a hesitation about taking a stand that could be perceived as in any way helping these very harmful elements in US politics, right? And so you just either stay away from it
Yeah.
or you kind of throw your lot in with the people who you see as generally on your side of things.
Yeah, right. But to the point that like they're actively trashing
Yes,
left-wing feminists in other countries for wanting to retain a tiny margin of safeguarding within a very like leftist set of positions just in
yes.
order to defend a left wing against a right wing position in the US with no nuance. Like I don't know, I've just found it absolutely striking, and I almost couldn't believe that's what was happening when it started happening, but it just became clearer and clearer that that
That
was
is
what
what's
was
happening.
happening. Yeah. um, and I think
No, I think
Jason Stanley actually, I think, has almost said that explicitly. That there was something recently where he was almost just saying that
well,
outright.
yeah, well, I don't know if we're referencing the same thing, but I know this was on Twitter where he has a large following, and I think he had gotten into it with a lot of British feminists, gender critical feminists, because I can't remember how he intervened in these discussions. Um, but at one point, he just said, I just see what the Nazis are saying, and I believe the opposite, or something like that.
Yeah,
And it's nice to see it said explicitly because
yeah,
there is a lot of that going on. And if you try to ask more substantive, well, do you mean to say, right, that it's okay, for example, for 13-year-old girls to have mastectomies, or for um, do you think it's right that um, trans women are women in every possible sense of the term, every plausible sense of the term, and for all political purposes? You'll never get a response.
mm,
I mean, you get, and I've tried this. Once you ask sort of the substantive questions, you generally get people not willing to respond because they sense the tension between, on the one hand, saying something they worry rightly will come off as being absurd,
yeah.
but on the other hand, saying something
Aligning,
that will alienate that sort of their what they perceive to be their broad political coalition.
right.
And so it stays on the level of the us versus them. And it's very difficult to have a substantive, a discussion on the actual arguments, the sort of first order debate, which is the most important debate, at least if you're approaching this as a philosopher or
But
even as a political activist.
do you think that they are mainly scared about being kind of piled on or cancelled within the tribe, or do you think that they're kind of virtue signaling and sort of doing it themselves, like they want to do everything they can to show that they're left wing and that this is their people and they hate that position? Like, is it fear or is it
Well, I
virtue?
think I think part of it, and I'm not talking about Jason Stanley here,
No,
but
just
in
anyone who
general,
does that.
yeah,
Yeah,
in general, I think part of it is ignorance of the substantive debates. I mean, not everybody finds this stuff super interesting. Not everybody follows it closely. Not everybody cares, and that's fine. It's a complex world. And not everybody has to care about sex and gender,
yeah,
right? So there are kind of useful heuristics. It is a useful heuristic, and if Donald Trump says something ethically noble thing, that you have some reason to think maybe it's not,
yeah.
right? And so I think there's some of that going on, which is just kind of what we all do. We defer our judgment to people we trust, and so there's a lot of that going
Yeah, okay.
on. But for the people who actually do know something, is a fear about saying something or doing something that would lead them to be alienated from the people who they feel to be supporting, or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
The feelings of people who they think it's very important to protect, right? So I think it's a mixture of things.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, I was.
No, can
Um,
I just tell you before you move on, your sound is absolutely fine, but your face is sometimes freezing. I don't know if
yeah,
you care, but I will just.
yeah. I just got a note saying that my internet connection was unstable, so I think that's just going to happen. I don't have
Yeah, okay.
terrific internet right
Okay.
now.
Yeah, the
Um,
voice has been totally fine, but just sometimes you're freezing and then sometimes you'll come right and yeah.
Okay. As long as, I mean, I think it's more important that
The
my
voice,
voice comes through.
exactly. I agree. Yeah.
Um,
I'll let you know if you freeze for like 10 minutes in a really unattractive pose so that you
right.
can reset
Right.
it.
Um, so, all right. So let's get into the book. And I thought maybe we could start with you giving just a general overview of what you are hoping, what the aim of the central aim or aims of the book is, what you're hoping to accomplish,
Mhm.
what you're hoping the book will stimulate in terms of scholarly debate and discussions on these issues, and then we'll get into some of the. I had some objections or questions about some of the points you make in the book.
Yeah, cool. Um, so the book is really about the movement, gender critical feminism, as it has kind of emerged in the last, I don't know what, 10, less than 10 years or so. Um, Trying to figure out sort of what it's about or what rationalizes it. One of my big concerns was to actually try to show slash argue that it's strongly continuous with radical feminism, the kind of second wave feminist theory and movement, and to try to sort of draw strong lines between the two. And part of that is like, because I just think it's true, but part of it is also sort of like hoping to make it true. So sort of both of those things at once, because I think there's some people that are gender critical or think of themselves that way. They came into it via opposition to some of gender identity ideology. They're really motivated by thinking this is kind of wrong to women, but they haven't fully conceptualized themselves yet as feminists in this broader way, right? So they maybe still think they're just opposing this specific ideology, but they haven't tracked through. But why do I care so much about that? Like, why is sex important? And what is this class group of female people? What are their interests, and how is their history led them to this point where we need a kind of politics? So I'm sort of trying to do that work. I guess I'm mainly speaking to the movement, kind of trying to give it a self conception and a way to organize and think about its priorities and its constituency. And maybe I'm a bit speaking to people that are curious and have kind of heard about that movement and wonder what it is and if it's a fascist. Um, yeah, and then I'm also sort of just being a philosopher, right? Which is like, is there some consistent story to tell about a kind of sex-based feminist movement, which sounds so stupid, and like 40 years ago that's just feminism, right? But somehow now it's a dissident heterodox position to say that there could be a movement that's just about half the population of the whole world, because that's weirdly exclusionary and non-intersectional. And so I'm just trying out like defending some ideas and critiquing some mainstream orthodox feminist positions that I think are poorly thought through. And yeah, so it's kind of doing a few different things, but that's the main stuff.
Right. Yeah. So in reading the book, one of the things I found striking is it's responsive to the point you just made, where what you're describing as gender critical feminism is what I just always took to be feminist. I
Feminism.
mean, these are not, even calling it radical. At the time, it was radical,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, we're in 2022. We're not in 1950, and so it is puzzling, and part of this has to do with I haven't. So you talk about this a little bit in the book, and maybe this is worth sort of pausing on for a minute, about the way that women's studies departments have sort of transitioned into being gender studies departments.
Yeah.
And so what happened? I mean, do you know what sort of happened in the scholarly community, such that those sorts of positions that we saw in what you're calling second wave um, they were taken. I don't know if they were just taken to have been established, and so it's sort of like, yay! Anybody who has a basic education understands these things. Now let's talk about things that are more cutting edge. Now let's talk about things that are more kind of um, the things that haven't been established. Sort of. So now we get sort of queer studies and gender. What happened there, such that over the last couple decades or something like that, few decades, those positions have to be kind of unearthed.
Mm.
right? I mean, the sort of second wave feminist positions, and now they're viewed as by many people as being somehow fascist or something like that. And it's very
Yeah,
strange.
it's really strange. Yeah, I actually don't know what the kind of historical explanation of the changes is. All I do in the book is sort of track that there was this period of flourishing high numbers of women's studies departments, right? And that it's really important to them that they were about women and by women. And then just somehow, some quite short period later, almost all of them have become gender studies or women's and gender studies in I think a few cases. But I don't know exactly what explains that. I mean, I guess we do know that in that sort of 70s liberation movement, identity politics period, there were other liberation movements, so sexual orientation movements and race movements. And we know there was this emergence of kind of queer theory, queer studies, gay and lesbian studies. Um, so plausibly, women's studies, I guess, might have just been the place that ended up seeming like the natural home for some of that. And
Yeah.
then, of course, as soon as you bring in new theory and methodology and people, you're expanding out what your scope is. But yeah, I don't actually know, even in one specific case like Sydney or whatever, I don't know what actually happened there that meant they ended up with this broader agenda. Of course, I know in feminism in general, sort of what these idea shifts were toward intersectionality or toward liberal individualism or neoliberalism. And that, of course, changed the nature of how feminists themselves were thinking about their departments and their projects. Um, but again, it's not clear if that's going to be the full explanation of the like shift to gender studies, which has a whole different like theory and methodology. Um, yeah, it would be really interesting to find out actually.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds like something that some intellectual historian could do the kind of work.
Yeah.
Um, so, uh, saying what gender critical feminism is, uh,
You just cut out quite a lot. Can you say that last bit again?
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Could you say what you take gender critical? What's the position? What is gender critical feminism? And then after you answer that, I have a up question.
I think it's very simple. I think it is a feminism for and about women as a sex caste. So the important
Mhm.
ingredients are sex. It's for female people, and caste slash class. It's somehow about women being, I say oppressed because to me, I don't think that word has so much baggage that it makes you want to vomit when you say it. But I know some people feel that way. So you could say marginalized, disadvantaged, having a history of repression or constraint, whatever you like. I don't think anyone's going to quibble that there was that history. We can argue about what women's position is now, but it's a sex based group that has a particular history and is maybe still kind of struggling to emerge from that history. So it's a politics about those people and for their equality slash freedom.
And by those people, you're referring to female
Female
people.
people, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And in the book, you are contrasting gender critical feminism with what you call, I believe, liberal feminism.
I think I this is sorry, it's just a slightly interesting issue because I think in like early drafts I called it liberal feminism, and then there was this whole thing with the publisher what they should be called,
Okay.
and part of that I think was actually quite helpful because in the colloquial sense that's the term we all use, libfems, and we know what we mean, like the ones that say porn is empowering and sex workers work and trans women are women and are just kind of relentlessly spouting orthodoxies. Um, but there was this question about what about the real liberal feminists? Like, and there are two, I think, or maybe there's five, but you know, the real liberals who take it seriously how to be both a feminist and a liberal and have carved out a position. So it's slightly misleading to. So there was this whole terminological thing, and I think I ended up actually avoiding calling them much of anything. I said something like the dominant form of feminism, or mainstream feminism, or orthodox feminism, or whatever. So that's set up as the opponent, but it's colloquially what we mean as when we say libfems
Okay.
on Twitter. Yeah. Sorry, that was a
So
lengthy aside.
no, that's helpful. I just think there might be some places where you use that term, so that's why I used it. But whatever we want to call it, it's the alternative to gender critical feminism. So maybe say just a bit about what you take that alternative to be, how it differs from gender critical feminism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, in lots of ways. So I think it's very committed to this sort of liberal individualism that's become very centered on ideas about choice and autonomy within the framework that we currently have. So it's very much about like whatever a woman chooses is a feminist choice, and we don't criticize her for choosing things that we might want to say are patriarchy enforcing, like getting cosmetic surgery or wearing a lot of makeup or dating a certain kind of men or whatever else, right? If she chooses sex work, that's her empowered choice. So it's partly about that. It's partly just about this kind of commitment to a set of orthodoxies, which I don't actually think are unified by any theory, really. It's just like there's this set of mantras that that group of feminists tend to be committed to. Feminism has to be intersectional now. You can't be an essentialist. They don't even know what it means usually, but you can't be that. So there's a certain, you should believe in standpoints and unique knowledge attaching to the oppressed, right? So there's that sort of bundle of stuff. But in the book, I think the most important commitments of the lib fem or the mainstream feminist are sex workers work, trans women are women, and feminism must be intersectional. And I sort of take on all of those claims.
So we're going to talk about those things, but before we get there, because you devote a fair amount of the book to intersectionality, I have some questions there, and also to the sex industry. But before I do that, what is an interesting point fairly early on, maybe it's in chapter 2, where you give an argument to the effect that that gender critical feminism as a theory of feminism has better explanatory and predictive power than mainstream feminism or lib fem, right? Whatever we call it.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important.
You cut out again. There you
Okay.
are.
Is that working?
Yeah, you're back. You got up to, I think that's a really important, and then you froze.
I can't remember what I was saying was important.
That
Okay,
gender critical feminism has more explanatory power, I think.
Yes. So the gender critical feminism has more explanatory and predictive power than this alternative. And that's something when you're just sort of deciding among theories of something, right? One of the things you want is explanatory and predictive power. And so I think that's an important point. And I was hoping you might elaborate a little bit there about the kind of phenomena that you think gender critical feminism better explains and what sorts of behavior or social patterns it better predicts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess you could do this in both directions, right? You could talk about whether it has a better story to tell about women's historical oppression. So, why and in what ways they have been subordinated or denied equal social power. And you could tell that story going forward. Which theory picks out a clearer constituency, unifies them for purposes of political action or solidarity, and how does it do that? So one way is just like it has a very clear constituency, right? There's no messing around trying to figure out which intersex cases fall on which side and what type of transition is sufficient, and is it gender expression or role or performativity or identity? No, just females. Stop it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's clear. And then because it has this commitment to the second wave conception of gender and the sex-gender distinction, which is as this set of external norms that are applied to people on the basis of sex, it can explain all sorts of, things to do with like pressure that might be applied differentially to the sexes to fulfill certain sorts of stereotypes or expectations. And those things can be kind of measured empirically, right? Like Cordelia Fine in Delusions of Gender goes through a bunch of evidence about, you can disguise babies so they look like the opposite sex and then see how differently parents play with them. And there's just tons and tons of literature on this stuff, right? So you just get a better story about what are these differential norms or pressures, or you can track the sorts of sanctions that might be applied. And you can sort of test this in different cases, right? So like the Amy Stevens case in the US, you've got a male person who wants to transition to work as a woman in a funeral parlor and so wear the women's uniform. The gender critical feminist is going to say, I predict that person is male, they're going to be held to standards of masculinity and masculine dress, and they're going to be sanctioned for non-conformity to the male standard. Is that in fact what we saw? Yes, right? So they've got one story. You try to tell that story.
Sorry, just to interrupt. This individual was fired, and that's why. That's the question is why were they fired? And gender critical feminism, for the reasons you just gave, can explain exactly why they were fired.
Yes, exactly. Whereas if the gender identity theorist was to try to scramble around for an explanation, what are they going to say? Oh, here we've got a woman, because it's identity that determines what you are. The woman wants to wear the women's uniform at work. Well, why would that be a problem? All the women are wearing the women's uniform at work. Why was he fired? Right? So there's just certain situations like that where actually, the gender critical feminist has a straightforward story to tell about what gender is and what sex is and how they work together. And the gender identity theorist, not just in that case, but for the entire thousands of years of women's subordination, what's their story, right? Oh, my identity, oh, all of those women just didn't identify as men. Is that why they were repressed? So, so that's kind of what I meant.
And it's sort of that particular case I thought was really interesting, and I think it illuminates the precise way in which gender critical feminism does have this kind of explanatory and predictive power, and also I think is related to what sort of counts as. I mean, everybody seems to agree that there's something that there's something that it is to be gender nonconforming. And without a kind of foundation of sex, it doesn't really make any sense. So you get people saying things like, "Oh, it's trans people are really the sort of gender benders and all that." And you're and it seems to me you're exactly right. Like if gender identity is what determines this person's gender, then why should we think that it's nonconforming or gender bending or radical? For this individual who identifies as a woman to dress in the way that women are traditionally expected to dress. They're just being women.
Totally.
And it's like the most conservative thing that you could hope that a woman would do is wear a dress or whatever it is that she's expected to do in that time, in that place, in that culture. So where is the gender bending happening? Where is the sort of radical questioning of gender going on that these people are claiming to be doing, right? It becomes, incoherence is a strong word, but it doesn't make any sense.
Now that you say that, I'm sort of wondering, because I was teaching about some philosophy of sexual orientation stuff today, and the point I'm going to raise is I wonder what changes when the society itself starts to fully buy into the gender identity or the gender role. So one of the examples that we were talking about is Fa'afafine women in Samoa. So they are fully acknowledged to be male, but living as women, right? So there's not this conflation between sex and gender role, but they get away with having gay relationships. That was one of the questions in the class, like, is that gay, right? Because on some of the theories of homosexuality, it was attractions between sex gender roles. So they were trying to sort of fudge so that you could say that's a heterosexual relationship when it's between a male and a Fa'afafine woman. So I'm sort of wondering now with the explanatory stuff, if the whole society thinks the man living as a woman is a woman and doesn't consider that gay, right? Then they're not going to be stigmatizing him for sexually non-conforming behavior relative to male standards. So there is this question. I mean, I guess that was always the case, right? The explanation of the discrimination is going to depend on the attitudes of the society. And in most societies, we track sex and conformity relative to sex. But maybe there are some societies that have carved out these sort of exceptions where you actually can be non-conforming in these specific ways to do with your sexuality or your dress, so long as you've gone into that category.
Yeah, those are interesting, and these, you've had some discussions recently with people just about sexual orientation because there seem to be quite a few people, I guess, given their commitments about the sort of ontology of gender or the metaphysics of gender, that think that orientation has to do with gender identity rather than with sex.
Yes.
And so you get questions like, well, what about straight men who are attracted to trans women, right? And then, of course, I mean, the answer has to be, well, I need to know more about like what the body of this person is like. So, we sometimes make mistakes, right? So, like a straight man, this is the example I use because I think any sort of straight man has had this experience, and I'm sure it happens to people of every orientation. You might see someone from a distance. You might be on a beach, right? And see someone with like long hair who has kind of a feminine body from a distance. And you might, for a second or for a minute, whatever. And, but of course, once you realize that it's a man, if you're a straight man, you're no longer interested.
Right.
And the question is, is there a point, could you imagine a point at which you would maintain interest despite the fact that this person is a male? And I think the answer is yes. I think if somebody has gone through full medical transition, a straight man could be attracted to this person, sleep with this person, and still would be considered straight. But the explanation there is that they, for all intents and purposes, have gotten the body of a female. Right? And so it's not like these cases raise especially sort of deep puzzles. It's not that we're attracted to the sexed soul of an individual. We're attracted to, I take it, certain kinds of bodies, and that's what grounds sexual orientation. I don't really see those as common examples.
I agree, but it'll be tricky because I think this is just from one documentary I watched, so I don't know how accurate it is, but I think even with the like Fofofine grouping, there's still different types. So there's transsexuals, but then there's what we would say is transgender, so they've got their penis still. And so you've got all the different like degrees of transition, and so I guess you still are going to have the harder cases where it's like two male bodies having sex in the way that males would have sex, but somehow it's not stigmatized as gender non-conforming in the way that it would be between two men, and there is homophobia, but somehow compatible with this one way of doing it. So that's interesting. I think.
No, that is interesting, and there's a question of sort of what's stigmatized and why. And then there's the question of are they having gay sex? Not. And I think that you could say, well, clearly this is sex between two males. I mean, here's another question. In their history, are they generally only attracted to other people who have this kind of body? Or is this an exception for them, right? So you need to know, that's why you sort of need to know more about their dispositions and the sort of their behavior historically. But those are two different questions, I take it, right? Like what's stigmatized and why. So you can imagine this is something that doesn't stigmatize that, right? And yet still believe that it is a gay relationship.
Well, I was sort of thinking about it in relation to the Amy Stevens type case. Like there we know we have these norms of masculinity about what a male person should wear, and it's certainly not a skirt suit. And so we can explain what we would expect to see him be, what we should expect to see him sanctioned for relative to being male. And then you would make the same point about the sexuality of a male, except there are these interesting carve-outs in some societies for some
yeah.
things. And so, yeah, I guess I was just getting on a rabbit hole of like, yeah,
And no. I mean, you can have sanctions on the basis of expression,
yeah,
right? That don't track don't track sexual orientation.
yeah, yeah. That's interesting. Mm.
Um, okay, so here's well, I'm going to phrase this in the form of a criticism because this is something that you've been criticized for. It's something that Kathleen Stock has been criticized for.
Yeah.
It's something that was mentioned in the so-called open letter, which wasn't really open to the University Press, which is that you don't engage sufficiently with literature. And so by the literature, so you do in your book discuss the work of trans-inclusive feminists. You discuss the work of Dembroff. You discuss the work of Sally Haslinger. You discuss the work of um, Jenkins. You don't, though. I take it there's some other area of scholarship that these people are referring to. Maybe it's the scholarship that's emerging or has been done in gender studies departments or queer studies, and there's this kind of objection that you're not doing your scholarly work because you're not engaging with that literature.
Mm.
What do you say there? Because it's not just a matter of people wanting to be cited. They might truly believe that there are views that have been defended in these domains, right? That you're being sort of that you're failing to engage with, and therefore your arguments are um, not doing what they need to do to sufficiently establish your position.
Yeah. So what? So my first defense, I guess, is just I'm a philosopher and I'm reading primarily philosophy. Um,
Yeah,
I think, is this something to the thought that you, depending what your subject is, you would kind of read more widely there? I think so. I mean, I'm currently working on sexual orientation and gender identity, and I'm reading shit tons of empirical literature because some of my questions are empirical, right, or they matter for the philosophy. So I certainly think you need to do that. Um, do I think I need to trudge through first personal biographies telling me that those men are women and why? I have trudged through quite a few, but I can't say that I've like come away suddenly convinced at any point that's true.
yeah,
Maybe there's some literature, yeah, hosted in gender studies, or I guess that's where it would be, right, or sociology or criminology or something about trans perspectives that's not first personal but has some argument where it's just an astonishingly good argument that yet hasn't made it through into the philosophical literature, and that would really
right.
change my mind. Maybe. I'd love to know what the reference is so I can save some time. But yeah, I can't say I'm super moved by this criticism. Um,
Well, yeah, so that's one of the things that is a bit puzzling about again this sort of professional approach to these topics. So if you just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and read about feminist approaches to sex and gender,
yeah,
it seems it's just acknowledged. It's acknowledged even by those writers who are arguing for trans inclusive accounts of what it is to be a woman. That the common sense everyday usage of woman and man, the words woman and man refer to adult human females or adult human males. And then their project is this sort of ameliorative project, right, where they're saying, well, look, we have these political aims, and so we want to construct this account of woman
yeah,
that is inclusive of trans women, and right. But it's clear what they're up to, and they don't. It's not that they're hiding this, right? That there's a certain political aim, and they
yeah,
think there are good ethical reasons and political reasons to adopt this other concept.
yeah,
And yet the response to sort of your approach is to as if there's some kind of fringe view, that it's just like a crazy fringe view to suggest, right, that a woman is an adult human female. And you do want to know, and I looked myself like, well, where are these accounts?
yeah,
And you ask people and you get things like, do your own research, or I'm not going to do your emotional labor for you, or, but like, where are the? I'm aware of the Jenkins. I mean, you discuss Jenkins. I'm aware of the Haslinger, and we can have philosophical discussion about whether those work
Mm.
or whether ameliorative approaches are philosophically wise or prudent to begin with. Right? There's those really important, interesting questions. But the notion that there are these like competing, well spelled out views of gender that we're somehow missing. I find that
Yeah. No,
thing
I'm
I cut out.
recalling an
As I
anecdote, and
was
I don't want to
rambling.
like tell who the people were because I can't remember exactly the substance, but there was an AOP, so the Australasian Association of Philosophy conference in New Zealand, where one of the establishment feminists apparently made this move in the question time of, I think, a keynote. Um, so did this like, oh, the literature, da 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 da, and the I don't know if he was being a dick or trying to be woke, but the keynote, as far as I've been told the story, said like basically carved out time so that she should tell what the literature is, and so she tried
Right.
to hand wave, oh, like I'm not going to take up the whole question time telling all the sources or whatever, but you should have read them. And then he says, oh, no, I think we can actually skip because
Yeah.
this is very important.
Right.
Like really
Yeah.
put her on the spot, and she just wouldn't. And apparently it was just sort of mortifying for everyone involved because usually these people can get away with doing that move, right? Oh, the literature over there that I refuse to tell you what it is, but it definitely is there and it definitely establishes this point, right? And it sort of, I think,
Right.
revealed the lie of it, right? That it's bluster. Um, so I can't remember what it was one of the orthodox feminist topics, but I can't remember exactly what the topic was. I just know who
Yeah.
the people were. But yeah, I think it's a common move. I don't know why, if there was some brilliant stuff, they wouldn't want to share it. So that seems a bit suspicious. Like,
Right. No,
yeah.
that's right. And in fact, it goes even deeper than that. If you read, um, I mean, if you read Dembroff, when you read Dembroff on gender, and I haven't read everything they've written, right? But I've read some. Um, if you read Talia Betcher, is that how you say Talia
Yeah.
Betcher? Betcher. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Um, when you read Sophie Gray Chappelle, you see that thoughtful, intellectually responsible academics themselves, trans writers, aren't committed to this sort of like, aren't necessarily committed to what it is to be trans as some kind of inner state or inner belief.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you have in this interview that Sophie Gray Chappelle gave, she says, look, for me, being a trans woman is about having a very strong and abiding desire to have the body of a female.
Mm-hmm.
That's a perfectly sensible thing to say, right? I'm a male.
Yeah.
I want the body of a female.
Yeah, I have this desire. Yeah.
I have this desire, and we know what desires are. We can talk about the desire, and then we talk about how we can understand an identity in terms of an abiding desire, right, or something like that.
Yeah.
So you get this sort of mainstream view of gender being a matter of identity that isn't even really. It isn't even. And if you question it, you're a transphobe. But when you read what trans writers are saying themselves,
Yeah, it's
they're
not
not
that.
even to that view.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if some of them
Right?
do in some discipline or other. Like maybe the queer studies ones do, the ones we're not reading.
Okay, but why aren't
Yeah.
philosophers? Why aren't they listening to other philosophers who are trans and who are telling, right, who are complicating this issue,
Right, or
and
why
who are
aren't the
not going?
philosophers, usually if there was some prominent uh, non-philosopher saying credible things somewhere that someone cared about, right, one of the philosophers would bring them in as their buddy and be making their views better known, and that's not happening.
That's right.
So
That's not happening either.
yeah,
Very bizarre.
yeah,
Okay, so I wanted to ask you because one of the, I think probably, well, to my mind, one of the most sort of provocative things that you do in the book is you call into question feminism's commitment to intersectionality.
yeah,
And intersectionality is, a very sort of important theme, concept, and so on for anybody these days thinking about writing about sort of social justice issues. And so, could you say a bit about your views on intersectionality? And then I want to ask you, um, it's more specifically about a case that you discuss in the chapter of intersectionality, that I think you attribute to um, Crenshaw, if I'm not mistaken, about a group of black women who were fired,
Hmm.
um, and they couldn't argue that they were fired because they were women, because the white women weren't fired, and they couldn't argue that they were fired because they were black, because the black men weren't fired.
Yeah.
And so it's a case where it's, right. Anyway, so say a bit about intersectionality, and we can talk about that case. And I have a different kind of case that I wanted to push you on a little bit too.
Yeah, sure. Um, so the uh, I would say every type of feminism today, I think that's true, thinks it should be intersectional. So it's become sort of cross-cutting rather than like, well, you're a liberal or a radical. It's sort of like, no, we're all intersectional. Um, and the thought there being maybe, so sorry, it's complicated, but maybe one early thought was kind of about multiple systems of oppression and the way in which or whether they kind of interlock. So whether kind of class comes along with sex oppression and the extent to which they could be disentangled, that's a simpler idea. Then Crenshaw comes along and sort of turns it into intersecting in a way where the parts, this the whole might be more than the sum of its parts. So you
Yeah,
kind of get this idea that like when race oppression intersects with sex oppression, it's not just the sum of both. You get this kind of novel, extra bad stuff going on. Um,
yeah,
and then somehow that's kind of the academic chronology and the sort of political one from the this again the 70s activists kind of pushing identity politics in these combined ways. But then you get the trickle down out of academia and that politics into the sort of everyday understanding. And the everyday understanding is just maybe something like you have to take into account all aspects of persons because persons are like complex bundles of privileged and unprivileged characteristics, and together you get a kind of winner and a loser hierarchy, and that determines who gets deferred to and who counts as privileged and therefore ignorable, and who deserves the bulk of the resources and attentions, and it sort of
yeah,
creates a pecking order. So there's a
yeah.
bastardization of it. There's an interesting two real versions of it, and it's all kind of a mess in how it's talked about and understood today. But I think the pernicious effect of it is that that bastardization version has made feminism about and for almost everyone and almost everything. Um, did that make sense?
And you, yeah, yes. I want to ask a little bit more about the sort of intellectual version or the scholarly version, but it does make sense. And the reason you're going to oppose that in defending gender critical feminism is because you think you're thinking about females as a caste, right? That should have that should that we should think of feminism as a movement for and by people who are members of this particular caste. And so once you start bringing in all these other dimensions along which someone might be disadvantaged or oppressed, you sort of dilute
Yeah.
feminism,
Yeah,
right?
and it's really
Or be,
important. It's not as though those people in the group don't have races, right? So the
yeah,
useful distinction, I think, is between is feminism a movement about women as women? So in the aspects of their lives to do with their sex or their socialization on the basis of their sex, or is it a movement for and about just the improvement of women as people? And then you might think, okay, yeah, if it was people, it would be sort of like doing national government, right? Like, of course, the government of Australia is for Australians as people in all of their welfare needs, right? So, of course, it's interested in their health and their poverty and so on. Is feminism like that? And some people think it is, some feminists think it is, and that's probably why they talk about race and poverty and all the complex intersections that make up a specific person's experience. But I think it's at least open to us to also talk about this movement that is really about femaleness and the social construction of femininity imposed onto femaleness and what the stereotypes of women and women's sexuality are. That's something else, right? And I think even if you think there's room for both movements, that one's surely not ruled out a priori in any way. So I'm sort of defending that as more tractable.
Yeah, if I'm understanding one of the things we might worry about losing.
Can you start again?
Through intersectionality.
Sure. Sorry, just that sentence.
One of the things you might worry about losing by adopting this sort of like robust intersectional approach is the sort of history of racism, the history of classism, the history of ableism, the mechanisms by which those work, the history of sexism, the mechanism by which those work differ. So, I mean, one of the things you notice among people who are really committed to this intersectional view is that you end up kind of committed to the view that there's just this kind of one bad thing that's like oppression, or it's just like injustice. And it's like, well, there's no, like, what is this platonic form of injustice that does all this bad stuff to people along these axes?
Right.
But there's no kind of explanation. There's no explanatory force that, well, why is it, how exactly, right, does racism keep people down, right? And are the people who are interested in preserving that the same people? Is the history the same history? Are the mechanisms the same mechanisms by which women understood as a female caste that they're kept down? And the answer is that, well, maybe, there's overlap, but it's not the same thing, and we lose an analytical power when we just say there's just this bad thing called oppression.
Mash it all together. I know, and I think part of the diagnosis of that is just that people are conflating the first personal experience of being oppressed when you have multiple disadvantaged aspects to your identity with what the world is like that makes that the case. And so I think because Kate Phelan and I have this separate paper on intersectionality where we do a bit of disentangling of this stuff. So I'm sort of drawing on that a bit in the book, but we're doing it more over in this paper. But it's like, the phenomenology of oppression to, say, a Black woman, that might be totally like, for her, it just feels like one thing coming at her. And maybe she can sometimes tell, but she can sometimes not tell which which thing it is. Is it sexism or racism, or is it both? But we could accept that it feels like one thing, or that you don't always know which thing it is, without accepting that when the world delivers discrimination or differential treatment or oppression to you, that it is one blob, which is exactly what you're saying. I think we lose heaps of important explanatory stuff if we say that the oppression out there is just a kind of blob.
But does this mean, and this is what I'm not sure about your view here, does this mean that we should not adopt or approach certain kinds of disadvantage intersectionally? Let me give you a kind of case. So there's this interesting report. I use this sometimes in my free will seminar when we're talking about kind of actual judgments and applied sort of judgments of moral responsibility. This was a report from the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown Law School. It's called "Girlhood Interrupted: The Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood." And so there's this really sort of depressing and important data on the adultification of Black children in the United States, right? So you look at sort of the judgments of police officers or just ordinary citizens, and people tend to judge the ages of kids differently based on their race. Mm-hmm. So what that means, right, is that they're held to their attributions of moral responsibility or criminal responsibility are going to differ. If you think a kid is 15 versus 9, right? Yep. One of the manifestations of this, with respect to girls in particular, Black girls in particular, is their judgments about how much they know about sex or how sexual they are.
Right.
Now, one complicating factor there is that black girls, at least in the United States, also go through puberty earlier.
Okay.
Okay, so their bodies start developing earlier, so they might appear to be older than they are, right? Now, a further wrinkle here is that one of the sort of I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding is that one of the explanations or plausible explanation for why black girls go through puberty earlier on average than white girls is because of there's environmental factors, right? There's more chemical exposure and so forth in the environment as a result of socioeconomic status, right? Of poverty and things like that. So you get class, race, right? And sex
Yeah.
all coming together such that black girls, right, are sexualized and viewed as being more sexually mature at an early age.
Yeah.
And that seems to me like a genuine case. Like if there's a kind of a way of, there's an analysis there that if you just think about it in terms of sex, you're going to miss something. If you think about it just in terms of class, you're going to miss something. And if you think about it just in terms of race, you're going to miss something. So I wonder what you think about, and at the end of the book, you have a feminist manifesto, and one of the things that you want, one of the worries that you have there, the hypersexualization of black women. So this is kind of in that ballgame too. So how do you think about a case like that? And maybe those cases are somewhat unusual, or maybe we can say we can apply an intersectional lens when for such cases it doesn't follow that feminism per se has to be intersectional.
Yeah, so I think what I end up saying in that chapter in the book is that there's going to be a lot of cases where the oppression is merely additive. And in those cases, there's no reason why we couldn't just have separate social justice movements taking care of each. The only cases that I think are candidates for feminism to take on, but it's not necessary or obvious that feminism should, maybe some movement should, maybe a new movement should, but the only candidates are these cases where you get more than the sum of its parts oppression in the Crenshaw way. So I think the question we would have to ask about your very nice example would be whether if you kind of solved poverty and you solved racism and then we resolved sexism, would that girl's situation be fully resolved, or would there still, is it like if you solved class and race? I don't know how to do that. If you solved one, would there be more of the right? So what's the thing that's causing more than the sum of its parts, or which things would knock it out? So that's and just to sort of say on that topic, I teach on this subject and I always try to gather the best cases I've come up with so far for where something is genuinely intersectional in that way. And this semester I was really pleased because I thought I had about 3 or 4 cases, and in the course of the tutorial the students managed to convince me that 2 of the 3, I think there was one standing at the end. So even though I was like, oh, I've found these really great cases, they're like, no, actually that is just poverty and sexism, but it's not poverty sexism in this particular novel way. So I would have to think through the details of that case more, but yeah, that would be what it hangs on, whether that is just the 3 kind of coming together, but not in a way that's really creating novel oppression. Or not. Yeah, and I don't have a clear instinct about that right now.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think it's an interesting case.
It's interesting.
I think it. Yeah. I can send you the report.
Yeah, please. Yeah, because that might be one I can give my students next year and see if they can debunk it.
Now, to be clear, I mean, the black boys are also adultified.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So it's not so clearly right, but it's the manifestation of the adultification. In the case of the girls, there's a sexual kind of sexualizing that you don't have in the case of boys, right? And so that's where maybe you can pull these things apart, right? Because it's affecting both the boys and the girls.
Yes.
But because of sort of sexism, it's the way the girls are sort of further disadvantaged. Now the boys are disadvantaged in other ways too that the girls aren't. Right?
Yeah. That's interesting.
Also, also do the sex gender expectations on the basis of sex, right?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
So
That's just,
I know it's late in Australia. I thought one of your other sort of central topics in the book is the sex industry,
yeah.
and so I had you're sort of you're really worried about the sex industry, and you give lots of arguments for why you think that in an ideal world, abolitionism is really sort of the ideal approach. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because that's that's one of the central commitments gender critical feminists from sort of what you're calling mainstream feminism and sort of sex work is work and so forth. Um, in so I, do you think I'm trying to figure out what you think is you explain why you think that prostitution is bad for women, and a lot of it has to do with the sort of like it's bad in itself because there are certain things that are inalienable, perhaps, right? That you ought not to commodify your body, and that's a kind of objection to prostitution that doesn't hang on the sort of larger social background in which prostitution happens, right? So we know that it's not rich women being trafficked,
Mm.
right? It's people who are disadvantaged, severely disadvantaged in many cases, who end up working as prostitutes. But supposing we could solve problems of sort of inequality, and supposing there weren't women who were working in the sex industry due to kind of economic desperation, do you still want to say that there's something objectionable about pornography or about prostitution, right? Even in a world where uh, we have kind of gender or sex egalitarianism.
Mm.
And I know maybe it's so I'm just trying to figure out whether the objection is a kind of per se objection or whether really what's going on is that we have these like massive inequalities such that, and we have these sort of such that men end up going and basically using women for like as a kind of commodity, as a sex resource that they pay for. And so even so people could agree with you there, but say that there's nothing in principle wrong with that. So I'm trying to figure out whether there's no.
Yeah. I'm at risk of going beyond the book in this answer because my next book is about whether it's morally wrong to buy sex, and it's focusing on the individual ethics of the male sex buyer, and it's a debate book, which is just to say I've spent the last 6 months or so in the weeds of this debate, and so I have specific views, but I can't quite track what my views were back for that book before they got here. So I can just give you my answer rather than the book's answer.
Yeah.
That is that it's not an in principle argument. So the position I'm at now is to say that it's really about the contingencies of our history and our world right now and what sex inequality looks like in our world. And I think it's open possibility that if we got rid of sex hierarchy in some version of the future, that stuff, both pornography and prostitution, could possibly evolve. I think the practice would look quite different, but it could be morally non-objectionable. In saying that, and this is a point I have from Kate Phelan, who I talk to about this stuff a lot, she sort of pointed out, and I think is quite plausible, maybe once we get to that world, right, we really have sex equality, it just becomes kind of unthinkable that we would want to be like paying each other for that stuff, right? Because how we think about sex and how the relations are between the sexes is just so radically transformed. And so I am kind of agnostic about like what that might all look like, right? Because it is quite hard to imagine.
Right. Yeah, it's really hard to disentangle the desires people have from the kind of social environment in which they live. So, right.
Yeah.
So you could say, well, in principle, there's nothing wrong with it, but people just might not be interested
Exactly.
in it once you have. But there's something about the inegalitarianism
Yep.
that leads that sort of the express or that the desire to buy sex is a manifestation or an expression of the in egalitarianism, and
Exactly.
that those desires go away once you have egalitarianism. And it's a
Exactly.
question that you can't really test for until you have. I mean, so it's sort of like the debates among Marxists about whether people would really, um, uh, whether our psychology is such that, right, people would be willing to live in a particular way, that they wouldn't be as selfish, that they'd be motivated by the common good as
Mm,
opposed to just self enrichment. And there are some people who say, no, it's capitalism, right, that perverts and distorts our desires and makes us rugged, makes us individualistic, right?
mm-hmm.
There's others who say, no, this is sort of a basic human impulse,
Yeah.
and that any kind of socialism has to take that into account.
Yeah.
There's no real way to test for that, right? But it's certainly possible and quite interesting, right, to think that if you have egalitarianism, gender egalitarianism, or sex egalitarianism, the question wouldn't arise because it would just be seen as undesirable, or it wouldn't occur to people.
Yeah. Yeah. My co-author, who is arguing the sort of liberal feminist line, she thinks, I think she clearly thinks that there would be sex buying in that kind of future, just because people might like not want romantic entanglements, but they want sexual pleasure. And so I think she probably has more in mind, like, yeah, everyone kind of does it who has this functionalist approach to like human stuff, and so women do it more. But so it's got the stigma is the wrong word, but the hierarchy is taken out of it. But there just will be some people that prefer the ease and straightforwardness of a transaction that has structure rather than the like messiness of a hookup and a uncertainty. And yeah, so I sort of see the pull of that as well. But yeah.
Um, Finally, I know I really don't want to hold you too long, but I wanted to ask you. This is something I've been thinking about, and sometimes I feel optimistic, and sometimes I feel pessimistic. Where do you think all this is going in terms of the kind of wider? There are these really sort of hot debates in the UK and Australia, US, and lots of places about pediatric gender medicine, about single sex spaces.
Yeah.
Um, do you think so? I mean, you might think the only thing that would stop the mainstream kind of approach is political activism um, by gender critical feminists and their allies and so forth, right? Another thing you might think is like, even if that particular view became dominant, there's something about it, and eventually just has to hit reality,
Yeah.
right? So it's like it's not a what's the word? It's not feasible, not because it'll be stopped through political actors, but because biology doesn't budge, right? And so it's just going to run into a wall eventually. Or maybe it won't run into a kind of wall. What do you think are the possible outcomes, and what do you think is most likely?
Okay, but you mean whether gender identity ideology is going to succeed and become the new normal, or whether
Yes.
eventually it just cannot be made to work and then we kind of just all swing back to.
Yes. I mean, it could be not be made to work because of activism. It could just lose as a political movement,
Yeah.
right? Or it could win as a political movement, but then there could be some kind of because it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think my inclination would be toward that. Like, I think it's had so much success socially and legally. And in some countries, it looks, like, I think we all think, oh, the UK is doing so well, so maybe we'll all be able to get there. But I'm really not sure of that. In Australia, we didn't have a consultation over moving to self ID in Victoria. We just moved there. And then we suddenly banned conversion therapy in a way that meant that you have to affirm all young kids' gender identities. And so we don't get to have the public debate. The law's already passed. The whole left wing media is just relentlessly propagandizing all trans identities, including children. So I do sometimes worry that it's like it's kind of here to stay here. But I think what will happen for sure is that for a while we pretend that there's just non-binary people who don't have a sex. But then at a certain point, it will emerge, oh, only the female ones are getting raped, or there's certain problems that really differ by sex, or what's happening in single sex spaces. There's lots of like leering or groping or whatever. So these problems will just emerge that show that sex is still functioning underneath this gender ideology. And I think that will then encourage people to like at least make the distinction again between these gender identity categories and sex. So I'm sort of hopeful that sense will always reemerge as an alternative, but I'm not sure if we'll be able to like drop the whole thing of gender
Yeah.
identity ideology. And I think that's really quite a serious conceptual loss. We talked earlier about the explanatory power of like gender critical feminism, but just having this, even if you don't like the theory, just having the concept of gender as this external stuff that's done to people, we drop that now and we just think that all of my students seem to think that it's just a subjective thing that you decide about yourself and then like put through in your action. So they don't have the tool to think about how they have been treated since they were small babies, and what people expect of them on the basis of their sex. Like they don't have that anymore. That's a loss. So I think
it's a loss, and it's just, I find it so strange, and I think there is a generational element, right? There's the younger people, and I know the term epistemic injustice gets thrown around a lot, but there seems to be something going on here where people lose the ability to describe accurately their own sort of experience and their own lot in life.
yes, yep,
So yeah, I mean, I think much of what's going on, a lot of it is purely sort of, a lot of it is linguistic, right? A lot of it is people using different words, but
Yep.
those words, people will do find out, don't change material reality, and that's where I think there's going to be this persistent kind of pushback by people who need to use certain words to work with and discuss reality,
I think
and
so
those
too.
who want to employ words in a way that don't correspond, right?
Yeah, you might actually get this a lot in inside gay communities as well, right? So like maybe for a while they're all going to go along with this idea that we're all just like men or women and it doesn't matter what the genitals are, right? But then surely some words or secret dog whistles or whatever are going to emerge to show who has the genitals you actually like, and to
That's
pair
right.
people together, because that stuff is really important to people, like who they date and who they have sex with. And
Sure.
so I think that there will be a place where this stuff will reemerge in some way or the other.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, no, that's right. They'll just find new words to describe the same things,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Do you have other things that you want to say? Anything else about the book?
No, I mean,
Or
no, it's been really nice to talk to you. It's great to have a philosophical conversation about the book. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah.
well, I enjoyed the book a lot. I found it quite enlightening. And I like, the early chapters where we talk about the history, especially, I thought were helpful in sort of situating gender critical feminism and explaining what it actually is so that people can learn for themselves and not come to believe that it's some kind of, I don't know, fascist movement or something really, really bizarre. So
Yeah.
thank you for writing the book. Thank you for all your work. And let's call it a day.
Cheers.